Picture this. Two warriors stand at opposite ends of a rain-soaked training ground. One has spent months surviving amphibious landings across Pacific atolls, storming beaches under withering fire, living off whatever the jungle grudgingly provides. The other has crawled through the bogs of Dartmoor in February, navigating by stars through biting Atlantic wind, earning a green beret that only 1 in 3 candidates ever gets to wear. Both are elite. Both are legendary. Both believe, with every fibre of their training, that their core is the finest fighting force the world has ever produced. And tonight, we're going to find out what makes each of them extraordinary, not just who is better, because that question is far more complicated and far more interesting than any simple answer. But where they came from, what crucible forged them, what history carved their identity, and how two nations on opposite sides of an ocean arrived at remarkably similar, yet fascinatingly different solutions to the same ancient problem. How do you build a warrior who can go anywhere, fight in any terrain, endure any hardship, and somehow come out the other side still standing? Tonight, we're going to travel back to the 17th century, to the damp, smoke-filled rooms where admirals first dreamed of soldiers who could fight on both land and sea. We are going to follow the Royal Marines through the cannon smoke of Trafalgar, through the frozen peaks of the Falkland Islands, through the scorched hills of Helmand Province. We are going to trace the United States Marine Corps from its birth in a Philadelphia tavern, yes, a tavern, through the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima, through the frozen Chosin Reservoir in Korea, through the streets of Fallujah. We are going to examine how they train, what they believe, what their cultures demand of the men and women who join, and why, even after centuries of warfare, both corps remain not just relevant but arguably more essential now than they have ever been. This is not a dry recitation of facts. This is a story, a long one, full of strange details and forgotten heroes and moments that change the course of history. So settle in, get comfortable, let the world outside go quiet for a while. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet where history and curiosity meet. And thank you, truly, for being here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I know someone out there is listening to this at midnight, the house completely still, everyone else long since asleep. This one is for you. And for everyone else who finds that the quiet hours are exactly when the old stories sound best. Let us begin. To understand why the Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps exist at all, you have to first understand a problem that has plagued every naval power in history. A problem so persistent and so vexing that it eventually drove military planners to create an entirely new kind of soldier. The problem is this: ships are powerful, but they cannot hold ground. They can bombard a coastline, blockade a port, and transport armies across vast stretches of ocean. But the moment you want to actually seize something, hold it, deny it to the enemy, make it yours, you need men who can step off a ship and fight. And fighting on land is entirely different from fighting at sea. A sailor in the 17th century was skilled in rigging, navigation, gunnery, and the brutal close-quarters chaos of boarding actions. But he was not a soldier. He did not drill in the disciplined formations of contemporary land warfare. He did not march in step or reload a musket with the mechanical precision that infantry officers demanded. He was, in the eyes of the army generals, dangerously uncontrollable when set loose on shore. Conversely, soldiers who were pressed into service aboard ships were often miserable, prone to seasickness, and deeply resentful of having been dragged onto a vessel at all. They did not understand the rhythms of shipboard life. They got in the sailor's way during emergencies, and they frequently had no idea what to do during a naval battle, except crouch behind something solid and pray. The solution, which various naval powers arrived at more or less independently across the 17th century, was the creation of a permanent corps of soldiers specifically trained for both environments. Men who could fight effectively aboard ship, in the rigging if necessary, certainly at the rail, absolutely in the terrible confined spaces below decks, but who could also land on a hostile shore and conduct organised military operations with the discipline and precision of professional infantry. This idea was not entirely new, even in the 1600s. The ancient Greeks had their marines called epipatai, who fought at the naval battles of Salamis and Aegospotami. The Romans had Liburnia, warships crewed in part by trained soldiers. The Portuguese age of exploration in the 15th century had involved men who were, in every practical sense, marine soldiers, fighting both at sea and on shore across Africa, India and Brazil. The Spanish tertios of the 16th century included units that regularly served aboard the great galleons of the fleet, combining land warfare discipline with naval service. But it was in the mid-17th century that the concept became institutionalised, organised and permanent, and the story of how it happened in England is, like so many British military traditions, deeply entangled with politics, money, and the peculiar ambitions of a king who was perpetually at war with his own parliament. Charles II of England was not, by most accounts, a king who inspired military confidence. He was charming, chronically unfaithful, perpetually short of money, and more interested in his mistresses and his horses than in the grinding administrative work of running a navy. But he was surrounded by men who understood exactly what England needed to project power across the globe, and one of those men was James, Duke of York, his brother and the future James II, who served as Lord High Admiral and took the navy extremely seriously. In October of 1664, as England drifted toward what would become the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the Duke of York authorised the formation of a new regiment. Its formal name was the Admiral's Regiment, though it was sometimes called the Duke of York and Albany's Maritime Regiment of Foot, a name so unwieldy that even its own men could barely say it. It was designed explicitly to serve aboard the fleet and conduct amphibious operations on shore. This is the moment the Royal Marines trace their founding. The date was October 28, 1664, and the regiment consisted of 1,200 men who were to be trained as soldiers, but would serve predominantly at sea. Their first major test came the following year at the Battle of Lowestoft in June 1665, where the English fleet engaged the Dutch in one of the largest naval engagements of the 17th century. The new maritime regiment fought aboard the warships, serving at the guns and in the rigging, and by most accounts acquitted themselves creditably in what was an English victory. But the real character of the corps was not forged in a single battle. It was forged across decades of continuous service, of being sent wherever the navy needed men who could do both jobs at once. The corps was disbanded after the Second Dutch War, reconstituted, disbanded again, reconstituted again, a pattern that would repeat itself with maddening frequency across the next century, driven always by the tension between the army, which did not want a rival corps of infantry, and the navy, which desperately needed one. Each time the Marines were disbanded, a war would come along that demonstrated, painfully and expensively, exactly why they were necessary. And each time they were reconstituted, the lessons seemed to be that some problems are so persistent that the institution designed to solve them eventually becomes permanent by sheer force of necessity. It was in 1755 that the corps was finally placed on a genuinely permanent footing. 3,000 Marines were raised and organised into 50 companies, divided between the three main naval ports, Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham. The man most responsible for this reorganisation was the Earl of Anson, First Lord of the Admiralty, a veteran circumnavigator who had sailed around the world and returned with a devastated crew and a captured Spanish treasure galleon, and who had spent the intervening years studying exactly why previous amphibious operations had failed. His answer was professionalism, permanent organisation, consistent training, a corps that did not have to be assembled from scratch at the beginning of each war, and dissolved at the end. The timing was, as it happened, excellent. In 1755, Europe was sliding toward the 7 Years' War. The conflict that Winston Churchill would later call the first truly global war, fought not just in Europe but in North America, the Caribbean, India, West Africa and the Philippines, all simultaneously. The British Empire's ability to project force across all those theatres depended in large part on the Navy, and the Navy's ability to operate in those theatres depended in significant measure on having soldiers who could operate amphibiously. The Royal Marines were about to have their moment. When historians talk about the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, they tend to focus on the great land battles of Europe, on Frederick the Great's extraordinary campaigns in Silesia, on the shifting alliances and continental politics. But for understanding the Royal Marines, the more important theatre is the one that rarely gets adequate attention: the global colonial war that Britain fought against France and Spain across virtually every ocean on Earth. Consider what was happening simultaneously in 1759 alone, the year that the British later called the Year of Victories. General James Wolfe's forces captured Quebec, ending French power in Canada. The Royal Navy destroyed a French fleet at Lagos off the coast of Portugal and shattered another at Quiberon Bay in Brittany. In between these massive fleet engagements, there were dozens of amphibious operations, raids on coastal towns, seizures of islands, landings to support colonial forces or to threaten enemy supply lines, and in virtually all of them, the Royal Marines were present. They landed on Guadeloupe. They participated in the capture of Senegal. They fought in the operations that led to the seizure of Havana from Spain in 1762, a campaign that involved a landing force of thousands in tropical heat, with inadequate supplies and devastating disease, and which succeeded, largely because the Marines maintained discipline in conditions that broke lesser units. The character that was emerging in these years was distinctive. The Marines were neither purely sailors nor purely soldiers. They occupied a middle space that gave them a unique perspective on military operations, and a unique set of skills. They were comfortable with improvisation in ways that conventional infantry were not, because amphibious operations rarely go exactly according to plan. They were disciplined in ways that sailors sometimes were not, because they had been trained in the infantry tradition of collective drill and mutual fire support. And they were developing, slowly and organically, a culture of professionalism that prized competence and adaptability above the social hierarchies that dominated the contemporary British Army, where purchasing a commission and possessing the right family connections often mattered more than whether you could actually fight. There is a story told about the Royal Marines at the capture of Belle-Île, a fortified French island off the coast of Brittany, in 1761. The initial landing was repulsed with significant casualties. The officer commanding the Marines, finding his men pinned on the beach under heavy fire, is said to have walked calmly up and down the waterline, completely exposed, directing fire with the same composed manner he might use on a parade ground. Whether or not the details of this story are entirely accurate, and with stories of this vintage, one is always wise to hold some skepticism in reserve, the archetype it represents is entirely consistent with what the Marines were becoming. Soldiers who performed best when things were at their worst, whose composure under fire was not mere bravado, but the product of genuine professional confidence. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the Royal Marines had established themselves as an indispensable component of British naval power. They numbered around 14,000 men at the war's peak, had operated in conditions ranging from tropical jungle heat to North Atlantic fog, and had developed tactics for landing under fire that would be refined and used for the next 2 centuries. But the next great chapter of their story was approaching, and it would come from a direction that nobody in the Admiralty had anticipated. While the Royal Marines were earning their reputation across the globe, something extraordinary was happening in the British colonies of North America. The 13 colonies stretching from Massachusetts down to Georgia were developing a political identity increasingly at odds with the authority of the Crown, and by the early 1770s, the tension between colonial self-governance and British imperial control had become a crisis that neither side seemed willing to step back from. The Revolutionary War that began at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 forced the Continental Congress, the governing body of the United Colonies, to confront the same problem that England had faced a century earlier. If the Americans were going to fight a war against the most powerful navy in the world, they needed men who could operate at sea, and if they were going to do more than simply defend their coastlines, if they were going to go on the offensive, raid British supply depots, seize enemy ships, project force across water, they needed the equivalent of what the British had spent nearly a century building. The Continental Marines were established by resolution of the Second Continental Congress on November 10th, 1775. The resolution authorised the raising of 2 battalions of Marines for service aboard the vessels of the nascent Continental Navy. The date, November 10th, 1775, is still celebrated by the United States Marine Corps as its birthday, a tradition of institutional continuity that runs unbroken to the present day. But here is where the story gets interesting and slightly murky and considerably more colourful than the official records suggest. The man most responsible for actually recruiting those first Marines was Captain Samuel Nicholas, a Philadelphia merchant and the frequenter of a particular establishment called Toon Tavern on Water Street, a gathering place for the city's merchants, sea captains, and assorted men of adventure. Nicholas used Toon Tavern as his recruiting headquarters, and the image of the Marine Corps being borne over tankards of ale in a waterfront drinking establishment has become one of the Corps' most cherished founding legends. The actual historical record is, as usual, somewhat more complicated. Nicholas did use Toon Tavern as a base of operations, but the records suggest that the proprietor of the tavern, a woman named Peggy Mullen, was also involved in recruiting, offering free beer as an inducement to enlistment, which, while perhaps undignified from the perspective of military tradition, was at least practically effective. The first recruits were a mixture of experienced sailors and former soldiers, and they would need to be ready to fight almost immediately, because the Continental Navy's first voyage was already being planned. The operational debut of the Continental Marines came in February and March of 1776. Commodore Isaac Hopkins led a small fleet south to the Bahamas, then a British possession, with the specific objective of seizing gunpowder and military supplies that the American forces desperately needed. On the morning of March 3, 1776, approximately 200 Continental Marines under Captain Nicholas landed on the island of New Providence, marching on Nassau and demanding the surrender of Fort Montague. It was, by the standards of later marine operations, a modest affair. The British garrison was small and the resistance limited. But it was the first amphibious assault in American marine history, conducted just under 4 months after the Corps' official founding. Whatever else might be said about the Continental Marines, they were not slow to get into the fight. The Revolutionary War proved a brutal education in the limits of a newborn corps operating without adequate resources or institutional support. When it ended in 1783, the Continental Marines were disbanded along with the rest of the continental military establishment. The young republic, exhausted by 8 years of war and deeply suspicious of standing armies, dissolved its armed forces with indecent haste. For the next 11 years, the United States would have essentially no navy and no Marines at all, and the consequences of that decision would become apparent with considerable and unpleasant speed. By the early 1790s, the United States was learning that being a maritime nation without a navy was not a sustainable position. French privateers were attacking American merchant shipping in the Caribbean with near impunity. The Barbary pirates of North Africa were seizing American vessels and enslaving their crews, demanding tribute that a proud new republic found deeply humiliating to pay. The Navy Act of 1798 created the United States Navy as a permanent institution, and on July 11th of that same year, the United States Marine Corps was formally established by Act of Congress. The Corps was organized under the command of William Ward Burroughs, who became its first commandant and who immediately set about creating the institutional foundations that the Continental Marines had always lacked: a permanent headquarters, a training system, standards of discipline and drill, and a set of regulations that distinguished the Marine Corps from both the Army and the Navy, while binding it to serve both. The more dramatic early test came in the Mediterranean, where the Barbary War beginning in 1801 brought American warships and Marines into direct conflict with the pirates of Tripoli. The most celebrated episode of this conflict involved a truly remarkable operation in 1805, a Marine officer named Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, operating with a force of 7 Marines and several hundred mercenaries and Arab cavalry assembled by the adventurer William Eaton, marched overland from Egypt across 500 miles of Libyan desert to attack the city of Derna from the landward side while American warships bombarded from the sea. The march took more than 7 weeks. The men were frequently near mutiny. Food and water were desperately short. O'Bannon reportedly spent much of the march mediating between the mercenary troops and the American officers, preventing the expedition from disintegrating through sheer force of personality and a willingness to share every hardship equally with the men he was leading. The attack on Derna on April 27, 1805 was the first time in history that an American flag was raised over a fortification in the Old World. O'Bannon personally led the assault on the harbour fort, being among the first men to crest the wall, and the Marine detachment fought with a ferocity that shocked the defenders. The city fell. It was a small victory in strategic terms. The war was ended by a negotiated treaty shortly afterward. But the symbolic power of what O'Bannon and his Marines had accomplished was enormous. Here was proof that the Marine Corps could operate not just aboard ships, but in the most demanding overland environments imaginable, on a shoestring, improvising solutions to problems that had never been anticipated, and winning against odds that should have been prohibitive. While the young American Republic was fighting its first tentative naval wars, the Royal Marines were being tested on a scale that dwarfed anything happening across the Atlantic. The wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, which consumed Europe from 1792 to 1815, were the most comprehensive military catastrophe the continent had experienced since the 30 Years' War, and the Royal Navy and its Marines were at the centre of Britain's strategy for surviving and ultimately defeating the Napoleonic Empire. The Battle of Trafalgar on October 21st, 1805, is the engagement most people associate with Nelson and the Royal Navy, but fewer people know the specific and critical role the Marines played in it. At Trafalgar, every British ship of the line carried a detachment of Royal Marines. In a large first-rate ship, this could be as many as 150 men, and their job was complex and multifaceted. They served at the guns during the approach, firing into the enemy, with the disciplined volleys of trained infantry. They acted as sharpshooters from the fighting tops, the platforms high in the rigging from which marksmen could fire down onto enemy decks. And it was this last function that turned the tide of the battle's most famous moment, and also ended the life of its most famous participant. Horatio Nelson was standing on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory when a musket ball fired from the fighting tops of the French ship, Redoutable, struck him in the shoulder, drove down through his lung and lodged against his spine. He died approximately 3 hours later, having been told that the battle was won. The identity of the French Marine who fired that shot has never been definitively established. The most consequential shot in the history of British naval warfare was fired by someone whose name history never recorded. What is recorded, and what matters for our story, is what happened next. The Royal Marines aboard Victory helped repel 2 attempts, by the crew of Redoutable to board the flagship, fighting at the rail with bayonets and small arms, preventing what would have been a catastrophic loss. The gun decks of a ship of the line during battle were scenes of almost incomprehensible noise and carnage. Cannon fire generated clouds of acrid black smoke that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet. The concussion of your own guns firing could knock a man off his feet. Enemy shot came through the timber walls of the ship in explosions of lethal splinters that killed and maimed with terrible efficiency. And through all of this, the Marines maintained their discipline and did their jobs. The war against Napoleon was not primarily a naval war, and the Marines spent much of the following decade engaged in the unglamorous, grinding work of amphibious raiding that kept significant French forces pinned down along the coastline of Europe, preventing Napoleon from concentrating his strength on land where he was at his most dangerous. They raided shipping in the Baltic, supported Spanish guerrillas fighting against French occupation, landed on island after island in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. They participated in the capture of the Cape Colony in South Africa, which secured the sea route to India. They were present at the siege of Flushing, struggling through the marshes of the Scheldt estuary in damp misery. None of these operations were glorious in the way that Trafalgar was glorious. Most of them were just hard. One of the lesser-known but genuinely significant episodes of this period was the Royal Marines' role in the Walcheren expedition of 1809, one of the most catastrophically mismanaged military operations in British history. 40,000 British troops were sent to the island of Walcheren in the Netherlands, with the objective of destroying the French fleet at Antwerp and opening a second front against Napoleon in his rear. The expedition was plagued from the beginning by poor planning, inadequate intelligence, and the slow, cautious generalship of its commander, the Earl of Chatham, a man whose nickname was the late Lord Chatham on account of his habitual tardiness, a joke that acquired grim significance when his delays allowed the French to reinforce Antwerp before the British could reach it. The fleet was never destroyed. Within weeks, Walcheren fever, a combination of malaria, typhoid and dysentery, was killing British soldiers at a rate that the French could barely match. The Marines who served in this catastrophe maintained their discipline through the fever and the futility, an achievement that was perhaps more impressive in its way than anything they accomplished in victory. The lesson the Royal Marines drew from Walcheren, a lesson that institutional memory would preserve for generations, was that even the finest amphibious troops in the world are helpless if the planning behind their operations is inadequate. Operational success requires more than soldiers who can fight. It requires intelligence, logistics, timing, and commanders who understand that every hour of delay in an amphibious operation is an hour that the defender uses to prepare. The War of 1812 put both corps in the same theatre for the first time, and on opposite sides of the same burning city. In August of 1814, a British force of approximately 4,000 men, including a substantial contingent of Royal Marines, landed at the mouth of the Patuxent River in Maryland and marched on Washington, D.C. At the Battle of Bladensburg, fought on the outskirts of the capital on August 24th, the American defence collapsed with remarkable speed. The militia broke under the pressure of British rockets and disciplined infantry fire. By evening, the British were in Washington, and the burning of the public buildings, the Capitol, the White House, had begun. For the American Marines, the most important episode of the War of 1812 was not Bladensburg, but the Battle of New Orleans, fought on January 8, 1815, in what had already become technically a post-war engagement. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed on December 24, 1814, but news of the peace had not yet reached the combatants in Louisiana. Andrew Jackson's force, which included a Marine battalion, defeated a much larger British army attempting to seize New Orleans. The Marines who fought in the defensive line that morning were part of a remarkable polyglot force: regular soldiers, sailors, pirates under Jean Lafitte, free black soldiers, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, that held its ground against British troops who had just defeated Napoleon and were among the most experienced soldiers in the world. New Orleans did not change the outcome of the war, but it changed the way Americans thought about their fighting forces, and it gave the Marine Corps a narrative of success to carry forward. The decades between the War of 1812 and the American Civil War were, for both corps, periods of institutional consolidation and cultural definition that would prove in many ways more important than the wars themselves. For the Royal Marines, the mid-19th century brought significant organisational change. The unification of the Royal Marine Light Infantry and the Royal Marine Artillery into a single force in 1855, creating a more flexible organisation and strengthening the culture of professional excellence that had been developing over the previous century. For the American Marines, the defining figure of this era was Archibald Henderson, who served as Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1820 to 1859, 39 years, and who essentially shaped the modern Corps through sheer force of will and longevity. Henderson was a Virginia gentleman of the old school, who combined personal bravery with political astuteness and a genuine understanding of what made the Marine Corps worth preserving. He understood instinctively that the Corps' survival as an independent institution depended on its being demonstrably better than the alternatives, and that in a democracy, institutional survival requires not just military effectiveness, but political visibility. The Marine Corps needed to be seen doing important things by the public and by Congress, needed to be present at moments of national drama, needed to cultivate a public image of valour and professionalism that would generate the political support necessary to preserve the institution against bureaucratic encroachment. The American Civil War presented the Marine Corps with an existential crisis unlike anything it had previously faced, because the war divided the country along the same lines that it divided every American institution. When southern states began seceding in late 1860 and early 1861, a significant number of Marine officers, most of them Southerners by birth, resigned their commissions and accepted appointments in the Confederate forces, among them the man who was widely expected to become the next commandant. The corps that emerged from the Civil War was different from the one that had entered it, somewhat larger, considerably more experienced in amphibious operations, and carrying the institutional memory of both its successes and its failures. The world that it now had to operate in was also changing rapidly, as industrialization transformed both warships and warfare in ways that were already rendering some traditional marine functions obsolete and creating demand for entirely new ones. While Americans were fighting each other, the Royal Marines were engaged in the endless, grinding, often morally complicated work of maintaining the British Empire, an empire that by the 1860s covered approximately a quarter of the Earth's surface and required constant military attention to sustain. The first and Second Opium Wars both involved Royal Marine landings in China, and these operations illustrated both the enormous military advantage that disciplined professional troops held over the armies they were fighting, and the profound moral questions that accompanied the use of that advantage in service of commercial interests that were, to put it plainly, indefensible. The Opium Wars were fought to force China to continue accepting British imports of opium from India, a trade that the Chinese government had banned on the entirely reasonable grounds that it was causing devastating social harm. The Royal Marines who participated in the fighting were not, for the most part, making moral calculations about the war they were fighting. They were professional soldiers doing what professional soldiers do. But the institutional memory of those operations is part of the full history of both the Royal Marines and British imperialism, and it cannot be written out of the story simply because it is uncomfortable. The American Civil War presented the Marine Corps with an existential crisis unlike anything it had previously faced, because the war divided the country along the same lines that it divided every American institution, and the Marine Corps was no exception. When the southern states began seceding in late 1860 and early 1861, a significant number of Marine officers, most of them Southerners by birth, resigned their commissions and accepted appointments in the Confederate forces. Among them was the man who was widely expected to become the next commandant. The effect on the Corps was devastating in the short term. Experienced senior officers were suddenly gone, replaced by more junior men who had not yet developed the experience and judgment that the vacated positions required. The Corps was already small, it numbered only around 2,000 men at the beginning of the war, and the loss of institutional knowledge was compounded by the general chaos of rapid wartime expansion that affected every branch of the Union military. The Civil War gave the Marine Corps some of its most dramatic and least remembered engagements. The most significant amphibious operations of the war were the Union's assault on Confederate coastal positions, Fort Hatteras, Fort Royal, Fort Fisher, and in these operations the Marines played important roles, doing exactly what they had been designed to do for 2 centuries, providing disciplined infantry capability in support of naval operations on and near the water. Fort Fisher, in particular, was an operation that would have lasting influence on Marine Corps doctrine. The massive earthwork fortification guarding the mouth of the Cape Fear River, the last major Confederate port open to blockade runners, required a combined naval and ground assault of considerable complexity. The Marine battalion that participated in the direct assault on the sea face of the fort took severe casualties, and the battle became a lesson in both the potential and the limits of unsupported infantry assault against prepared defensive positions. The Corps that emerged from the Civil War was different from the one that had entered it, somewhat larger, considerably more experienced in amphibious operations, and carrying the institutional memory of both its successes and its failures. The world that it now had to operate in was also changing rapidly, as industrialization transformed both warships and warfare in ways that were already rendering some traditional marine functions obsolete and creating demand for entirely new ones. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Victorian Royal Marines were engaged in the endless, grinding, often morally complicated work of maintaining the British Empire, an empire that by the 1860s covered approximately a quarter of the Earth's surface and required constant military attention to sustain. The Victorian Age was, for the Royal Marines, a period of almost constant operational deployment, even if most of those deployments were too small to make the history books in any lasting way. A typical Royal Marine of the 1860s or 1870s might serve tours of duty that took him from the barracks at Portsmouth to the West African coast, where the Navy was fighting the slave trade and occasionally landing parties to destroy slave depots, to the Persian Gulf, where pirates were periodically operating, to the Far East, where the various opium wars and their aftermath kept British forces in a state of intermittent conflict with Chinese forces and with the assorted local powers that had arisen in the wake of dynastic instability. The First and Second Opium Wars both involved Royal Marine landings in China, and these operations illustrated both the enormous military advantage that disciplined professional troops held over the armies they were fighting, and the profound moral questions that accompanied the use of that advantage in service of commercial interests that were, to put it plainly, indefensible. The Opium Wars were fought to force China to continue accepting British imports of opium from India, a trade that the Chinese government had banned on the entirely reasonable grounds that it was causing devastating social harm. The Royal Marines who participated in the fighting were not, for the most part, making moral calculations about the war they were fighting. They were professional soldiers doing what professional soldiers do, which is follow orders and fight as effectively as possible. But the institutional memory of those operations, of professional troops used to enforce commercial exploitation, is part of the full history of both the Royal Marines and British imperialism, and it cannot be written out of the story simply because it is uncomfortable. The more conventionally heroic episodes from this era include the Royal Marines' service during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, where naval brigades, including Royal Marines, were landed from ships and marched inland to assist in the relief of besieged British garrisons. The image of sailors and Marines marching across the subcontinent, hauling naval guns overland by sheer muscle, is one of the more extraordinary tableaux of Victorian military history, a demonstration of that peculiarly British military adaptability that consistently found ways to deploy naval power in contexts that no admiral had originally envisioned. They were not just Marines at that point. They were improvised infantrymen, artillerymen, engineers, whatever the campaign required, and the institutional culture of the Royal Marines, which had always placed adaptability alongside discipline as a core professional value, showed itself in the way those men transitioned from their shipboard roles to the dusty, ferociously hot inland campaigns without missing a step. The decades between the Indian Mutiny and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 saw the Royal Marines deployed to Egypt, to Sudan, to the coasts of West Africa, to Hong Kong, to the Caribbean, to virtually every corner of the expanding British imperial system. They were present at the bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, at the failed relief expedition for General Gordon in Khartoum in 1885, at the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. Each of these deployments added something to the collective institutional knowledge of the Corps, knowledge about climate, terrain, logistics, the management of local forces and local populations, the specific challenges of operating at the end of very long lines of communication from a home base that was weeks or months away by the fastest transport available. By the end of the Victorian era, the Royal Marines had participated in operations on every continent except Antarctica, in climates ranging from the Arctic to the equatorial, against opponents ranging from tribal warriors armed with spears to regular armies equipped with modern European weapons. This global experience had produced a corps of extraordinary breadth, men who could not be surprised by any terrain or any climate, who had developed a collective body of knowledge about amphibious operations that was unmatched anywhere in the world, and who had internalized a culture of disciplined improvisation that would be tested to its absolute limit in the catastrophic wars of the 20th century. No account of either the Royal Marines or any other amphibious force can pass through the First World War without stopping at Gallipoli, because Gallipoli is the great cautionary tale of amphibious warfare, a vision that was genuinely brilliant, executed with tragic incompetence, and paid for in a currency of human suffering so extravagant that its shadow lay over British strategic thinking for the next generation. The concept behind the Dardanelles campaign of 1915 was, in its origins, one of the more imaginative strategic proposals of the war. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, argued that the Western Front, where opposing armies faced each other across a system of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, had become a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency that was devouring soldiers by the hundreds of thousands without producing any decisive movement. The alternative was to strike at the soft underbelly of the Central Powers by forcing the Dardanelles Strait, capturing Constantinople, knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and opening a supply route to Russia. It was an audacious plan. It was also, as it was executed, a catastrophe. The Royal Marines were at Gallipoli from the beginning. The Royal Marine Light Infantry was part of the Royal Naval Division, a force created from surplus naval personnel organised as infantry for land service. This was not the Royal Marines acting in their traditional amphibious role. This was the Royal Marines being used as conventional infantry in a grinding land campaign that bore almost no resemblance to the kind of operations for which they were trained and suited. The landings on April 25, 1915, on more beaches at Cape Hell and at what became known as Anzac Cove, were the largest amphibious operation in history to that point. On some beaches, the landings achieved surprise and the initial objectives were seized, but on others, the defenders, Turkish troops under the command of Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, were waiting. And waiting defenders with machine guns facing infantry landing on open beaches produce results that are almost too horrible to describe clinically. The Royal Marines and their compatriots in the Royal Naval Division fought at Gallipoli for most of 1915, taking part in the various offensives that were launched to break through the Turkish lines and that consistently failed to do so, at enormous cost. The poet Rupert Brooke, who served with the Royal Naval Division, died of blood poisoning before he ever reached Gallipoli. The novelist A.P. Herbert survived Gallipoli to write about it with a bitter clarity that captured the experience of men who had been sent to do something that could not be done by the means available to them. The Royal Marines who survived Gallipoli carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives, and the institutional lessons were equally enduring. Gallipoli demonstrated that amphibious operations require overwhelming naval gunfire support that can suppress defenders during the landing phase, and that the naval technology of 1915 was not adequate to that task, because the flat trajectory of naval guns made it impossible to hit defenders who had withdrawn even a short distance from the beach. It demonstrated that intelligence about beach gradients, offshore obstacles, and defender positions was absolutely critical, and that intelligence gathering before Gallipoli had been inadequate in almost every respect. And it demonstrated that once an amphibious force is ashore and has failed to achieve its initial objectives quickly, the advantage shifts decisively to the defender. These lessons were, in a sense, already known. Military theorists and experienced officers had understood them for decades, but Gallipoli burned them into institutional memory in a way that abstract study never could, and they would directly influence the planning and execution of the next generation of amphibious operations, including the largest amphibious operations in history, which were still several decades in the future. For the United States Marine Corps in the First World War, the defining experience was entirely different. America entered the war in April 1917, and the Marines who went to France found themselves fighting on the Western Front, on land, in the trenches, in exactly the kind of warfare that the Corps had not been designed for and had not practiced. They fought magnificently, particularly at Belleau Wood in June 1918, where a brigade of Marines, approximately 9,000 men, stopped a German advance that had broken through French lines and was threatening Paris. The Battle of Belleau Wood lasted nearly a month. The Marines attacked again and again against prepared German defensive positions, taking casualties that at times seemed unsustainable, refusing to yield ground they had taken, earning from the Germans the nickname Teufelshunde, devil dogs, that they would carry with pride for the rest of the century and beyond. They cleared Belleau Wood yard by yard, position by position, in fighting that was as brutal and as physically demanding as anything that happened in the First World War. It was exactly the wrong kind of fighting for an amphibious corps. There was no water anywhere near Belleau Wood, and it cost the Corps a larger percentage of its total strength than any previous engagement. But Belleau Wood also confirmed something about the Marine Corps that Archibald Henderson had intuited half a century earlier, that the Corps' survival and identity were bound up with its public reputation, and that a dramatic victory in a high-visibility engagement was worth more politically and institutionally than 10 equally important victories in obscurity. Belleau Wood was covered extensively by American journalists, and the image of the Marines as the cutting edge of American military power, ferocious, disciplined, unstoppable, entered the national consciousness in a way that it never quite left. The years between the two world wars were, for both the Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps, periods of intense doctrinal development driven by the memory of what had gone wrong in the last conflict, and the anticipation of what would be required in the next one. The Royal Marines were reduced in size significantly during the 1920s, and the period of creative operational development that might otherwise have followed the hard-won lessons of Gallipoli was constrained by Treasury parsimony and by the general reluctance of British defence planners to think too hard about the kind of major amphibious operations that would require rebuilding capabilities that had been expensively allowed to atrophy. The story of the United States Marine Corps in the interwar period is, by contrast, one of the most intellectually remarkable episodes in the history of military doctrine. A generation of Marine officers, men like Pete Ellis, who died under mysterious circumstances in the Pacific while conducting what was essentially unauthorized intelligence reconnaissance of Japanese-held islands in the 1920s, and Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, and a score of others who would become the architects of the Pacific War, dedicated the interwar years to solving the problem that Gallipoli had so violently posed. The problem, stated simply, was this: how do you assault a defended beach? How do you land troops against an enemy who knows you are coming, who has had time to prepare, who has machine guns covering every approach, and who can bring up reinforcements over land faster than you can bring up supplies over water? Gallipoli had demonstrated that under the conditions of 1915 you could not do it, successfully. But the Marine Corps' planners had to believe, because the alternative was to concede that amphibious assault was impossible, which would have negated the Corps' entire reason for existing, that with the right combination of technology, firepower and technique, the problem could be solved. The result of this collective intellectual effort was the Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, published in 1934, which became one of the most influential documents in the history of military doctrine. It identified the key requirements for a successful opposed landing: overwhelming naval gunfire and air support that could suppress beach defences during the approach, specialised landing craft that could carry infantry from ships to shore in minimum time, specialised vehicles that could operate in both water and on the beach, and a command and control system that could manage the incredible complexity of coordinating ships, aircraft, landing craft and infantry in real time against a resisting enemy. In 1934, most of these requirements were aspirational rather than actual. The landing craft specified in the manual did not exist. The amphibious vehicles did not exist. The whole doctrine was essentially theoretical, brilliantly reasoned theory, built on the bitter lessons of Gallipoli, but theory nonetheless. It would take the shock of the Second World War to test it against reality. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Marine Corps numbered approximately 70,000 men. By the end of the war, it would number nearly 500,000. The expansion was astonishing, but what was more astonishing was that the Corps maintained the quality of its training and its culture through that expansion. Not perfectly, not without strain, but with a consistency that speaks to the strength of the institutional foundations built over a century and a half. The Pacific War was, in its essence, an island-hopping campaign, in which American forces had to seize, one by one, the island chains that stood between the continental United States and the Japanese home islands. Each island assault was a test of the amphibious doctrine that the Marine Corps had developed in the interwar years, and the learning curve was steep, bloody, and unforgiving. Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942, was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, and it nearly ended in disaster. The Marines who landed found themselves ashore with inadequate supplies. The Navy withdrew its transports after Japanese naval forces threatened the landing area, and facing determined Japanese counterattacks that, night after night, tested the defensive perimeters around Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airstrip that became the strategic prize around which the entire campaign was fought. The 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal cost the Marines over 1,600 dead and several thousand wounded, and it cost the Navy a series of devastating surface engagements that at one point left the Americans with no operational carrier in the Pacific. But Guadalcanal was won, and the winning of it, the holding of the perimeter through those desperate nights, the systematic destruction of each Japanese counterattack, the gradual accumulation of air power on Henderson Field that eventually gave the Americans daytime control of the island's airspace, demonstrated that the Marines could do what the doctrine said they could do. They could land on a defended beach, establish a perimeter, hold it against counterattack, and conduct offensive operations to expand it. The interwar theorists had promised it would work. At Guadalcanal, it did. The learning that accumulated at Guadalcanal was applied at Tarawa in November 1943, the assault on a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands that became one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The planning for Tarawa was meticulous, far more careful than anything attempted at Guadalcanal, but the intelligence was wrong in critical respects. The water over the reef surrounding Betio, the main island, was shallower than expected, and the Higgins boats that were supposed to carry Marines across the reef ran aground, leaving men to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under intense fire. In the first hour of the battle, the casualties were catastrophic. Marines were dying by the hundreds before they reached shore. Individual Marines, finding themselves leaderless because their officers had been killed, made decisions in the moment that altered the course of the battle, pushing inland despite orders to consolidate on the beach, attacking flanking positions that were raking the landing force, maintaining enough forward momentum to prevent the Japanese from organising a coordinated counterattack. The battle lasted 76 hours. By the end, virtually the entire Japanese garrison and nearly 5,000 men were dead. American casualties were more than 3,000, including nearly 1,000 killed. The photographs from Tarawa, the bodies of Marines floating in the lagoon, sprawled on the beach, staring from foxholes, were among the first uncensored images of American combat dead to be released to the public, and they shocked the nation. Until Tarawa, the official policy had been to avoid showing American dead. After Tarawa, the policy changed, partly because someone in Washington understood that the reality of what was being sacrificed needed to be visible in order to sustain the national will for the campaigns that were still to come. The campaign moved westward and northward across the Pacific: Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island a Salter graduate seminar in the art of opposed amphibious landing, each one adding to the body of hard-won knowledge about what worked and what did not. Peleliu was a battle that challenged the doctrine in ways that the planners had not anticipated. The island was defended not by troops waiting in fixed positions on the beach, but by a garrison that had retreated into an elaborate system of caves and tunnels in the interior, emerging to fight and then withdrawing before American firepower could be brought to bear. The battle lasted more than 2 months and cost the 1st Marine Division more than 6,000 casualties, far more than the pre-battle estimates had predicted. But it is Iwo Jima, fought in February and March of 1945, that remains in the collective memory as the supreme test of the Marine Corps in the Second World War, not because it was the largest battle or the costliest, but because of what was captured at the summit of Mount Suribachi on the morning of February 23, 1945, when a Marine photographer named Joe Rosenthal photographed 6 Marines raising a replacement American flag on the highest point of the island. The image Rosenthal captured has been analysed endlessly since 1945. Art historians have compared its composition to classical paintings. Psychologists have studied why it resonates so deeply across generations. Veterans have debated the specific identities of the 6 men, 3 of whom were killed before the island was secured. But what matters for our purposes is what the image meant institutionally, and that meaning was articulated most precisely by Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded all American naval forces in the Pacific when he said of the Marines on Iwo Jima that uncommon valour was a common virtue. It was and remains one of the most precisely calibrated phrases in the history of military tribute. While the American Marines were writing their Pacific epic, the Royal Marines were fighting a war that was, if anything, even more varied in its geography and its demands. A war that took them from the Arctic fjords of Norway to the beaches of Normandy, from the rivers of Burma to the stone streets of Sicily, from the frozen mountain passes of Greece to the blazing desert wadis of North Africa. The most significant transformation the war produced for the Royal Marines was the creation of the commando units. The commando idea, small, highly trained raiding parties that could strike by night or by surprise against targets on the enemy-held coastline, was not originally a Marine concept. It grew out of the desperate improvisation of the early war, when Winston Churchill, appalled by the passivity of British defensive strategy after Dunkirk, demanded that someone find a way to carry the war to the enemy coast. The early commandos drew from all branches of the service, and they conducted raids of varying success and varying sanity against targets from Norway to the Channel Islands. But over time, the Marine Corps took the commando concept and made it its own. By 1942, the Royal Marines Commandos were among the most distinctive and capable formations in the British order of battle, small units of specially selected and intensively trained men who had passed through a selection process designed to eliminate those who could not sustain maximum physical effort under maximum psychological stress, trained in a range of skills: demolitions, small boat handling, cliff climbing, unarmed combat, languages, that went far beyond the conventional infantry repertoire. The Dieppe raid in August 1942, a large-scale operation against the French port of Dieppe, that ended in near-total disaster for the Canadian troops who bore the brunt of it, cost Royal Marine units severely and produced lessons about assaulting defended ports that were grimly useful in planning later operations. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, D-Day, were the largest amphibious operation in history, and the Royal Marines played an essential and often overlooked role in them. Royal Marine Commandos were among the assault troops landing on Sword Beach on the British left flank, tasked with linking up with the airborne forces that had landed inland during the night, and with securing the critical bridge at Pegasus Bridge. Marines landing at Sword Beach on that morning of June 6th faced murderous fire, perhaps not quite as intense as what greeted American troops at Omaha, but terrible enough, and the accounts of men who waded ashore that morning, watching their companions fall around them, using the bodies of the dead as cover, pressing forward because the only alternative was to die in the water, are among the most harrowing testimonies of the entire war. By the end of the war, the Royal Marines had served in virtually every theatre, had conducted operations in more different environments than any other British force, and had demonstrated that the commando transformation was not a temporary wartime expedient, but the direction in which the Corps needed to continue developing. The decision, taken in the immediate post-war years to make the commando role the central identity of the Royal Marines, was one of the most consequential institutional decisions in the Corps' history, and it set the template that exists to this day. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and swept south with startling speed, was in many ways the conflict that defined the modern United States Marine Corps, not because of the initial amphibious landing at Incheon, brilliant as that was, but because of what happened afterward, in the mountains around the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, when the 1st Marine Division found itself encircled by Chinese forces in one of the most brutal environments imaginable and had to fight its way out. First, Incheon. The landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950, was General Douglas MacArthur's strategic masterstroke, an amphibious assault deep behind North Korean lines that would cut the supply lines of the North Korean army besieging the Pusan perimeter and potentially collapse the entire North Korean position in the south. The Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed the operation, citing the extreme tidal variations at Incheon. The difference between high and low tide was more than 30 feet, meaning landing craft would only be operable for a brief window twice a day. MacArthur went ahead anyway, reportedly telling his skeptical audience that the very difficulty of the operation would ensure surprise. The enemy commander will reason that no one would be so brash as to make such an attempt. The Marines who landed at Incheon, primarily the 1st Marine Division, made it look almost easy, which was in itself deeply misleading about how hard it was. They secured the beaches quickly, moved through the city of Incheon with controlled aggression, and within days had recaptured Seoul, the South Korean capital. The North Korean army, its supply lines cut and its rear threatened, collapsed into a fighting withdrawal that rapidly became a rout. MacArthur's gamble had worked, and the Marines had executed it with the kind of precision that seemed to validate everything that 2 decades of doctrinal development had promised. Then came China. In October 1950, as United Nations forces pushed north toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army began crossing into Korea in vast numbers. By late November, approximately 120,000 Chinese soldiers had positioned themselves in the mountains around the Chosin Reservoir, and the 1st Marine Division, together with elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division and a small British force, was advancing directly into the trap. The temperature at Chosin in late November 1950 dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Weapons froze. Blood plasma used for transfusions froze. Sea rations froze solid inside their cans. Men had to warm their hands in each other's armpits to maintain enough dexterity to fire their weapons. In these conditions, on the night of November 27th, the Chinese attacked along the entire length of the Marine column, cutting it into isolated segments and destroying a significant portion of the army units on the eastern shore of the reservoir. Facing complete encirclement, outnumbered by a factor of roughly 10-1, in temperatures that were killing men through hypothermia before the Chinese bullets could reach them, the 1st Marine Division did not break. It did not surrender. Instead, under the command of Major General Oliver P. Smith, who delivered the line that has become one of the most famous statements in Marine Corps history when a reporter asked about the Marines' retreat. "Retreat, hell! We're just attacking in a different direction." It organised itself as a fighting unit, designated its objective as the port of Hungnam on the coast, and fought its way out. The breakout from Chosin took 17 days. It was 78 miles through mountains held by a Chinese army that was doing everything in its power to stop the Marines. They attacked Chinese roadblocks frontally, because flanking them through the mountain terrain was not possible in the snow and darkness. They evacuated their wounded on vehicles, even when those vehicles were needed for other purposes, because the Marine principle that you do not leave your dead or wounded behind is not a slogan, but an operational commitment. Men fight harder, take more risks, press further forward when they believe that if they are hit, they will not be left. By the time the 1st Marine Division reached Hungnam on December 11, 1950, it had been in continuous combat for 17 days. It had taken casualties that would have destroyed most units, and it arrived with its organisation intact, its discipline unbroken, and its heavy equipment mostly preserved. 14,000 men had survived what should, by any reasonable military calculation, have been a catastrophic annihilation. The years after the Second World War were also a period of painful institutional adjustment for the Royal Marines. Britain was retreating from empire, slowly, reluctantly, sometimes chaotically, and the question of what exactly the Royal Marines were supposed to be in the post-war world became genuinely pressing. The answer that emerged was that the Royal Marines would become, first and foremost, commandos. The commando capability that had been developed during the Second World War would be the Corps' defining characteristic, its reason for existence in the post-war order, and the foundation on which everything else would be built. The commando course at Lympstone in Devon developed into a 32-week ordeal, the longest initial military training course in NATO, that combined infantry skills, amphibious techniques, navigation, survival, weapons handling, and a series of physical tests that served both as measures of fitness and as measures of something harder to define, the determination to continue when continuation seems impossible. The most famous of these tests is Commando Week, which culminates in a series of events that must be completed to earn the Green Beret. The endurance course involves approximately 6 miles of obstacle course and cross-country movement in full kit, followed immediately by a shooting test. The Tarzan assault course involves rope climbs and aerial obstacles. The 9-mile speed march must be completed in 90 minutes, and the 30-miler, a 30-mile march across Dartmoor, one of the bleakest moorland landscapes in Britain, in full kit, carrying weapons, must be completed within 8 hours for officers and 10 hours for other ranks. The Green Beret that is awarded at the end of Commando Week is not, it should be understood, merely a hat. It is, in the understanding of everyone who wears it, the physical embodiment of something that was earned at tremendous cost, that was refused to roughly 2 in every 3 candidates who attempted it, that represents a standard of capability and determination that distinguishes the wearer from the merely fit and merely skilled. The culture it anchors has proved remarkably durable through every change of equipment, doctrine, and deployment pattern over the past half-century. The Royal Marines were tested in a series of colonial conflicts during the 1950s and 1960s, Malaya, Suez, Cyprus, Aden, each of which added to the institutional knowledge of counterinsurgency and jungle warfare, and each of which refined the commando approach to small unit operations in complex environments. The Malayan emergency in particular was a formative experience for Royal Marine officers and NCOs who served there, as the jungle warfare techniques developed in that conflict, deep patrolling, hearts and minds engagement with local populations, intelligence-driven operations, became part of the Corps' doctrinal toolkit that it would draw on in subsequent conflicts. The Malayan emergency lasted from 1948 to 1960 and was fought against the Malayan Communist Party's armed wing, which operated from jungle bases in the peninsula's dense interior. The Royal Marines who served in Malaya found themselves operating in an environment that was in almost every respect the opposite of the Arctic and coastal settings their training had emphasized. The jungle was hot, wet, claustrophobically dense, and navigable only by those who had learned to read it, who knew that movement through primary jungle was measured in hundreds of yards per hour. that sound carried strangely under the canopy, that the same track that seemed familiar in daylight became completely unrecognisable at night. The Royal Marines adapted, as they always had, by learning from those who knew the ground, from local trackers, from experienced officers who had served in earlier jungle campaigns, from the patient accumulation of hard-won experience that is the only real teacher in environments where doctrine written at a desk rarely survives first contact with the terrain. The Suez Crisis of 1956 produced one of the more vexed and ultimately humiliating episodes in post-war British military history, and the Royal Marines were at its centre. The operation to seize the Suez Canal zone following Egyptian President Nasser's nationalisation of the canal involved an Anglo-French assault on Port Said in November 1956, in which 45 Commando Royal Marines conducted one of the first helicopter assaults in military history, landing from HMS Ocean by helicopter, in what was, from a purely technical standpoint, a successful demonstration of a revolutionary new technique for delivering troops rapidly into a contested area. The Marines secured their objectives. The operation, however, was called off after 48 hours under American diplomatic and economic pressure, and Britain and France were forced into a humiliating withdrawal that made clear, for anyone who had not already understood it, that the age of independent British imperial military action was over. It was a political catastrophe disguised as a military operation that had technically succeeded, and the Royal Marines who served in it were caught in the gap between the two. Cyprus, Aden, Borneo, Northern Ireland. The list of deployments that followed through the 1960s and 1970s has the quality of a long, grinding education in the permanent difficulty of translating military capability into political outcomes. Northern Ireland, in particular, where the Royal Marines conducted multiple tours of duty across the 30 years of the Troubles, from 1969 to 1998, was the most sustained counterinsurgency experience that any element of the British military accumulated in the post-war period. The specific skills that Northern Ireland demanded, the ability to operate in a population-dense urban environment, to gather intelligence while conducting daily patrolling, to make split-second use of force decisions under legal and political scrutiny that would have been unimaginable in any previous conflict, to maintain professionalism and discipline over years of grinding routine punctuated by moments of explosive violence, were skills that could not be improvised and that required exactly the kind of individually capable, self-disciplined commando soldier that Lympstone had been producing since the 1950s. The Royal Marines served in Northern Ireland with a consistency and professionalism that is perhaps less celebrated than it deserves to be, in part because counterinsurgency success is measured in the absence of catastrophe rather than in dramatic victories, a standard of achievement that is genuinely important and genuinely difficult to communicate to audiences accustomed to measuring military success by more spectacular metrics. The United States Marine Corps went to Vietnam in March 1965, when the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade landed at Da Nang, the first American combat troops to arrive in Vietnam, and it stayed until April 1975, when the last Marines were evacuated from the American Embassy roof in Saigon, in what became one of the most humiliating images in American military history. The decade between those two moments was, for the Marine Corps, a period of extraordinary operational complexity and institutional stress. The Corps fought in Vietnam with everything it had, with the full weight of its doctrine, its culture, its training, and its institutional identity. And what it found was that none of those things were quite adequate to the war that it was actually fighting. Vietnam was not a war of amphibious landings and the seizure of clearly defined objectives. It was a war of ambiguity, of insurgency, of a population that did not sort cleanly into friend and enemy, of an opponent who refused to stand still and fight in the way that all of the Corps' training and doctrine assumed he would. The Viet Cong were patient in a way that the Marine Corps' culture of aggressive action found deeply frustrating. They would engage, break contact, melt back into the population, and reappear somewhere else entirely. They fought on a timeline measured in years and decades, not in operational phases and campaign plans, and the infrastructure of the conflict, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of tunnels and caches, the political organisation embedded in every village, was immune to the kind of direct military action that the Corps had spent a century preparing for. The Marines adopted an approach to counterinsurgency in their tactical area of responsibility the 5 northern provinces of South Vietnam, known as a corps, that was, in some respects, more sophisticated than what the army was doing in the rest of the country. The Combined Action Programme embedded Marine, squads with local popular forces militia, living among the village population rather than operating from large fortified bases, building relationships with the people that were intended to generate intelligence and reduce the Viet Cong's ability to operate covertly. It was a textbook counterinsurgency approach, patient, relationship-focused, willing to accept short-term vulnerability for long-term gain. Marine officers who championed the program argued, with considerable justification, that it was producing better intelligence and more sustainable security than any number of large unit search and destroy operations. But the Combined Action Programme operated in the same operational environment as the large unit sweeps and search and destroy operations that General Westmoreland favoured, and those operations, which displaced populations and generated civilian casualties, and validated every piece of Viet Cong propaganda about American brutality, tended to undermine exactly the trust and goodwill that the Combined Action Programme was trying to build. The Marines were, in a sense, fighting 2 different wars simultaneously, and the war that the Combined Action Programme was trying to win was constantly being disrupted by the war that the attrition strategy was actually fighting. The city of Hue, captured by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces during the Tet Offensive in January 1968, became the site of one of the most brutal urban battles in Marine Corps history. The ancient imperial capital, with its dense networks of streets and fortified walls and buildings designed for defence, had to be cleared house by house, room by room, in fighting that lasted nearly a month and cost the Marines over 200 dead. The Marines who fought in Hue had no doctrine for urban warfare. The training manuals of the time barely addressed it, and they improvised tactics in real time, learning what worked and what got men killed through the most expensive form of experimentation imaginable. The lessons of Hue, about clearing buildings, about the use of armour in urban terrain, about the integration of supporting fires in an environment where the friendly civilian population was present, would be documented, studied, and incorporated into doctrine that would not be tested again until Fallujah in 2004. In between, the institutional memory of Hue faded somewhat, as institutions' memories of painful experiences often do, and the relearning at Fallujah carried its own price in blood. The Marine Corps suffered approximately 13,000 dead in Vietnam, and it brought home a generation of veterans who'd been tested in ways that no previous generation had been, not just by the fighting, which was real and brutal, but by the experience of conducting an intensely difficult counterinsurgency in conditions of strategic incoherence, of executing a mission whose ultimate objective was never clearly defined and whose achievement was never honestly assessed. The institutional trauma of Vietnam shaped Marine Corps thinking about doctrine, about civil-military relations, and about the relationship between tactical excellence and strategic success for decades afterward. It produced a generation of officers who were deeply skeptical of the idea that military professionalism alone could compensate for strategic incoherence, who understood, from direct and painful experience, that winning battles is not the same thing as winning wars. On April 2, 1982, Argentine military forces invaded the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic, 8,000 miles from London, and seized them in a matter of hours. The small detachment of Royal Marines stationed on the islands, Naval Party 8901, numbering approximately 70 men, attempted to defend Government House in Port Stanley against a force of 600 Argentine Special Operations troops and Marines. They held for 3 hours against overwhelming odds, killed and wounded approximately 24 Argentine soldiers, and finally surrendered only when continued resistance became meaningless. The commanding officer, Major Mike Norman, reportedly refused to sign the surrender document initially, and the terms that were eventually agreed on were unusual, in that the Royal Marines were allowed to surrender with honour, marched out with their weapons and their dignity, photographed by an Argentine Marine who recognised what he had just witnessed, even in defeat. The photograph of those 70 Royal Marines lying face down in the mud at gunpoint became one of the defining images of the Falklands War, not as an image of defeat exactly, but as an image of what needed to be avenged, of what the British government had allowed to happen through a decade of defence cuts that had signalled to Argentina's military junta that Britain no longer had the capability or the will to defend its distant territories. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher decided otherwise, and the task force that sailed south to reclaim the Falklands was, by any measure, a remarkable feat of strategic willpower and naval logistics. 3 Commando Brigade, consisting of 40, 42 and 45 Commando Royal Marines, plus the Parachute Regiment battalions attached to it, was the core of the land force that would have to recapture the islands. They had been trained for operations in Arctic and mountain environments, and the Falklands, while not technically Arctic, offered conditions of cold, wind and rain that were reminiscent enough of the Norwegian training grounds, where the Corps regularly exercised to feel, if not familiar, at least previously encountered. The peat bogs of East Falkland, however, were something genuinely new. Terrain so soft and waterlogged that movement across it was exhausting even without weight, and the Marines would be carrying 80 pounds each, in weather that shifted from sleet to sun to driving rain, inside the same hour. The landing at San Carlos Water on May 21, 1982, codenamed Operation Sutton, was the largest British amphibious operation since Suez, conducted against the threat of Argentine air power that had already demonstrated its capability to sink British warships. The loss of HMS Sheffield to an Exocet missile had already shown that the Royal Navy's air defences were not adequate to the Argentine air threat, and the men landing at San Carlos knew that the ships that had brought them there were being attacked from the air even as they came ashore. HMS Coventry and Atlantic Conveyor were sunk during the landing phase, the latter carrying much of the heavy-lift helicopter capability that the ground forces had been counting on for mobility across the island's roadless terrain. The loss of those helicopters was a logistical catastrophe that fundamentally altered the character of the ground campaign and produced one of the Falklands War's most extraordinary episodes. When it became clear that the helicopters were gone, the solution was characteristically Royal Marines. They walked. 45 Commando conducted what became known as the Yomp from Port San Carlos to Stanley, approximately 60 miles across the peat bogs and ridges of East Falkland, in weather that changed from sleet to sun to snow to rain within the course of a single day, carrying loads that averaged around 80 pounds per man. The Yomp took 3 days and covered terrain that most military planners would have said required vehicle transport. The Marines did it on foot because the vehicles were not available, and because that is what the training, all those hours on Dartmoor in the rain, all those miles of the 30-miler with a full load on frozen ground had prepared them for. The battles that followed, Goose Green, Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Tumbledown, Wireless Ridge, were fought at night, against Argentine positions that in many cases were well prepared and well defended, manned by soldiers who were conscripts, but who fought with a determination and courage that the Royal Marines consistently respected, even as they defeated them. The assaults on Two Sisters and Mount Harriet on the night of June 11th and 12th involved Royal Marines fighting through rocky terrain in complete darkness against an enemy that had had 6 weeks to prepare its defences, that knew the ground and had registered its guns and placed its machine guns to cover the most likely approaches. The casualties were significant. The achievement was real. By June 14th, 1982, the Argentine forces had surrendered, and the islands were back under British control, and the Royal Marines who had been photographed lying face down in the mud at gunpoint in Port Stanley 10 weeks earlier were, by an extraordinary and improbable reversal, the ones in control. The Falklands War produced 2 things that are relevant to understanding the Royal Marines as they exist today. It produced a renewed recognition in Britain and internationally that the commando capability of the Royal Marines was not a Cold War luxury, but a genuine strategic asset, that the ability to project force rapidly over long distances in difficult terrain and austere conditions was something that could not simply be contracted out or improvised from conventional forces, and it produced a generation of Royal Marine officers and NCOs who had commanded in combat, who had made life and death decisions under fire, and who brought that experience back into the training and doctrine of the Corps with an immediacy that peacetime training alone can never provide. The 1990s brought both corps into a new operational environment of seemingly random and unpredictable crises, ethnic conflicts, failed states, humanitarian emergencies, terrorism, that did not fit neatly into any of the doctrinal frameworks that the Cold War had produced. The Gulf War of 1991 gave the Marine Corps one of its most successful operational performances of the modern era. The feint toward the Kuwaiti coast, maintaining an amphibious task force offshore to suggest a landing that never came, tied down several Iraqi divisions, allowing the main coalition ground attack to achieve its flanking maneuver more easily. The deception was elegant and effective, a demonstration that the threat of amphibious assault can be as strategically valuable as the assault itself. The Royal Marines went to Sierra Leone in 2000 as part of Operation Palliser, the British military intervention that effectively ended the civil war that had been tearing that country apart for a decade. The speed and decisiveness of the British intervention, which involved Royal Marine Commandos among its spearhead forces, helped stabilise the situation at a moment when the West African peacekeeping force was on the verge of being overrun. It was exactly the kind of rapid intervention that the Falklands had demonstrated was valuable, and that the post-Cold War defence debates had sometimes suggested was unnecessary. September 11, 2001 changed everything, and for both the United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines, it changed the operational landscape in ways that were both immediately dramatic and deeply complicated over time. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon set in motion a sequence of events that would define the operational experience of an entire generation of Marines and Royal Marines commandos, placing both corps in conflicts that lasted far longer, cost far more, and produced far more ambiguous results than anyone in authority was initially willing to admit. The United States Marine Corps was among the first forces into Afghanistan, conducting a long-range helicopter assault in November 2001 to seize Camp Rhino, a desert landing strip in Helmand Province that became the first substantial American ground presence in Afghanistan. The helicopters flew from ships in the Arabian Sea, more than 400 miles across Pakistani territory, in darkness, navigating terrain that offered no landmarks and no margin for error. It was exactly what the doctrine described: rapid power projection from the sea into a landlocked country. And it was executed at a moment when the entire world was watching. The operation served the institutional purpose of demonstrating that the Marine Corps was in the fight from the beginning, and also of demonstrating something more fundamental: that the investment in amphibious and expeditionary capability, the decades of training and doctrine and equipment procurement, had produced an organisation that could reach further and strike harder than anything else in the American military inventory. Afghanistan in those early months was, in many ways, the kind of war that both the USMC and the Royal Marines had been built for: fluid, mobile, operating in austere terrain with limited logistics and a premium on small unit initiative. The Special Operations Forces that led the initial campaign, working with Northern Alliance militias and American air power, moved fast and won decisively in the conventional phase. But as the initial victory consolidated into an occupation, and as the Taliban and their allies retreated into the mountains and the villages and the cross-border sanctuaries of Pakistan, the character of the war changed entirely, and the challenge shifted from the kind of mobile warfare at which Marine and Commando doctrine excels to the grinding population-centric counterinsurgency that neither corps had made its primary training focus. Iraq in 2003 brought the Marines into a different kind of campaign, one that would define Marine Corps operations for the next decade and produce lessons that are still being assimilated. The march to Baghdad, the initial conventional phase of the war, played magnificently to Marine strengths. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force advanced with a speed and controlled aggression that reflected the best of the Corps' combined arms doctrine, and the fall of Baghdad on April 9, 2003, seemed to validate both the military strategy and the political assumptions that had produced it. The statue of Saddam Hussein toppled in Firdos Square, and for a brief moment the war seemed over. It was not over. It was barely beginning. The insurgency that followed the conventional victory demanded exactly the kinds of counterinsurgency skills that Vietnam had taught were essential, and that the intervening years had not always preserved as institutional priorities. The Marines who found themselves patrolling Iraqi cities in the summer and autumn of 2003, dealing with ambushes, improvised explosive devices, a population that was simultaneously grateful for the removal of Saddam and deeply suspicious of the foreign troops now occupying their country, were fighting a war for which their training had given them some of the right tools and none of the right context. They adapted, as Marines always have adapted, with improvisation and professionalism and a willingness to learn from mistakes. but the learning was expensive, measured in lives and in the creeping, corrosive loss of strategic direction that set in as it became clear that there was no straightforward plan for what came after the initial military victory. The two battles of Fallujah became the defining combat episodes of the Iraq War for the Marine Corps. The first battle, in April 2004, was called off before it was completed, a decision driven by political considerations. Images of civilian casualties were creating a propaganda crisis that overrode the military logic of finishing what had been started. The Marines who withdrew from Fallujah in April 2004 understood that they would have to go back, and they were right. The second battle, in November 2004, Operation Phantom Fury, became the most intense urban combat that American forces had experienced since the battle for Hue City in Vietnam in 1968. Fallujah in November 2004 was a city of approximately 300,000 people, most of whom had evacuated in the weeks before the battle at the coalition's urging, leaving behind an insurgent force of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 fighters who had had months to prepare the urban terrain. They had knocked holes through the walls of houses to create covered movement corridors that bypassed the streets. They had booby-trapped doorways, stairwells, and the bodies of the dead. They had stocked fighting positions with weapons and ammunition. They had created a city within a city of interconnected defensive positions that could not simply be bypassed or reduced by air power without destroying everything. The Marines who assaulted Fallujah did so house by house, room by room, with a controlled violence and a tactical patience that combined the Corps' traditional aggression with a level of careful, methodical, small-unit work that civilian observers found difficult to reconcile with the popular image of Marines as blunt instruments. They used tanks to breach walls rather than drive through doors. They moved through holes in walls rather than through doorways that might be booby-trapped. They cleared each building with overlapping fields of fire and a speed of movement designed to prevent defenders from organising effective resistance. The battle lasted 6 weeks and cost the Marines and their Army and Iraqi partners approximately 100 dead and more than 600 wounded. The insurgent dead numbered in the thousands. Fallujah was, in a purely tactical sense, a Marine victory of the first order. It was also, in the larger strategic context of the Iraq War, insufficient. One city cleared, at great cost, while the insurgency continued and adapted and found new ground on which to operate. This is the fundamental paradox of counterinsurgency, and it is a paradox that neither the Marine Corps nor any other military organisation has been able to fully resolve. Tactical success does not automatically translate into strategic victory when the ultimate objective is political rather than military. The Royal Marines in Afghanistan were deployed primarily to Helmand Province beginning in 2006, and what they found there was a conflict that challenged their training and their doctrine in ways that the Falklands and Northern Ireland and the earlier colonial wars had not. Helmand was, in many respects, the worst possible environment for the kind of operations that the Royal Marines had been optimised for. It was not Arctic. It was not a coastal environment suited to amphibious operations. It was not urban terrain of the kind that the USMC had confronted at Fallujah. It was a complex agricultural landscape of irrigation ditches, compound walls, poppy fields, and open desert, bisected by a major river, with a population that had survived decades of war by maintaining relationships with all sides simultaneously and committing to none. 3 Commando Brigade deployed to Helmand on multiple occasions. The rotations ran from 2006 through to the drawdown of British forces in 2014, each rotation bringing a new set of tactical lessons in a conflict that required constant adaptation. The terrain demanded a different approach to patrolling, to intelligence gathering, to the relationship with the local population that the Royal Marines Commando ethos had always emphasised, but that Helmand made dramatically more difficult. An enemy who wore no uniform and moved among civilians, who planted improvised explosive devices that could kill without warning, who used the population as cover and the landscape as a weapon. This was not an enemy that traditional amphibious or commando doctrine had been designed to address. What Helmand confirmed, for the Royal Marines, was that the 32 weeks of commando training, the physical standards, the navigation, the small unit leadership, the fundamental emphasis on individuals who can think and decide and act under pressure without waiting to be told, provided exactly the right foundation for the most demanding operational environments, even those that bore no resemblance to the environments the training had been designed to prepare them for. The men who had earned their Green Berets at Lympstone were capable of sustained combat operations in extreme heat, against an enemy who was often indistinguishable from the civilian population, in conditions where the immediate decision of a corporal or sergeant could have strategic consequences. The commando ethos, the emphasis on individual capability, on adaptability, on the willingness to act decisively on incomplete information, proved its value in a war that defied every neat category of military doctrine. Both corps brought home from Afghanistan and Iraq something that cannot be adequately described as simply lessons learned, a phrase too clean and too bureaucratic to capture what actually happened. They brought home the experience of sustained combat over years and multiple deployments, of watching colleagues die and of making decisions that meant others lived or did not, of operating for months at a time in conditions of physical discomfort and psychological pressure that only approximate in peacetime training could approach. They brought home skills and instincts and reflexes that are genuinely useful in combat and genuinely difficult to maintain or transmit in the absence of combat. And they brought home, many of them, the invisible wounds that combat leaves, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty of readjusting to a civilian world that had continued its ordinary life while they had been doing something extraordinary and terrible and necessary in places most people will never see. We have been talking about the history of these two corps for a long time now, and it is time to turn to the question that probably brought many of you to this video in the first place. What does it actually take to become a United States Marine or a Royal Marine Commando? Because the training pipelines of both corps are, in a very real sense, the mechanism by which all of that history, all of that institutional identity, all of those hard-won lessons is transmitted to each new generation. The United States Marine Corps basic training lasts 13 weeks, which is longer than Army or Navy basic training. It begins with the arrival at the recruit depot, an experience specifically designed to be psychologically disorienting. The bus arrives at night. The arrival is managed chaos. Drill instructors appear instantly, screaming instructions that make no immediate sense, and the recruit is given approximately 30 seconds to realize that everything familiar about his or her life has been suspended. This is not sadism. It is the first stage of a deliberate process of identity reconstruction that removes the civilian self and begins building the Marine identity in its place. The 13 weeks progress through phases of increasing physical and mental demand. The crucible, the final test of recruit training, is 54 hours of continuous operations with severely limited food and sleep, involving physical tests, tactical exercises, and demanding situations designed to force recruits to rely on each other, to push past physical limits that they thought were real, but that the crucible reveals are actually voluntary stopping points rather than genuine limits. Recruits who complete the crucible receive their eagle, globe, and anchor, the Marine Corps emblem, in a ceremony at dawn from the hands of their drill instructors, and it is the moment at which they first become Marines. What is distinctive about Marine Corps basic training is not just its physical difficulty — other military training programs are comparably or even more physically demanding — but its cultural dimension. The 13 weeks are as much about identity formation as about skills acquisition. Marine recruits are taught Marine history, Marine tradition, Marine values, the specific ways in which Marines carry themselves and speak and present themselves to the world. They learn about the battles that came before, about the men and women who wore the uniform before them, about the long chain of sacrifice and excellence that they are now being invited to join. The Royal Marines equivalent is, in some respects, even more demanding. Recruit training at Lympstone lasts 32 weeks, more than twice as long as American Marine Corps basic training, and it is widely regarded as the longest and most demanding infantry training course in NATO. The failure rate is consistently around 30%, though in some intakes it runs higher, and the men who drop out or are injured out do not carry any stigma. The standard is set at a level that acknowledges that not everyone who wants to be a Royal Marine Commando is capable of becoming one. Consider the story of a young man from Sunderland in the northeast of England who arrived at Lympstone in the autumn of 1982, 6 months after the Falklands War had ended. He was 19 years old and had been working in a shipyard since leaving school. He had read about the Falklands in the newspapers, had seen the photographs of the Marines yomping across the island with their enormous loads, and had decided, with the clarity that sometimes descends on young men when they encounter an image of what they might become, that this was what he wanted to do with his life. The 32 weeks at Lympstone nearly destroyed him, not in any dramatic or sudden way, but through the slow accumulation of demands that never quite let up. The constant requirement to perform at a level that felt unsustainable, and that was, in fact, unsustainable for roughly a third of his intake. By week 12, 7 men had left the course, some through injury, some through voluntary withdrawal. By week 20, 4 more were gone. The young man from Sunderland was still there, but there were nights in the 4th month when he lay on his bunk and could not identify a single part of his body that did not ache, and could not imagine with any conviction how he was going to get up the next morning and do what the next morning required. What kept him going, he said many years later, was not toughness in any simple sense, not the impassive resistance to discomfort of someone who simply does not feel things as acutely as others. It was something closer to stubbornness, combined with a specific and personal humiliation at the thought of failing, combined with a realization, which came to him gradually and then all at once, somewhere in the 6th week, that the instructors were not trying to break him. They were trying to break the unnecessary parts of him, the hesitations and self-imposed limits and instinctive cautiousness that civilian life produces in everyone, and which are liabilities in the environments that commandos operate in. Once he understood that, the training felt different. It still hurt, but it hurt purposefully. He earned his Green Beret on a November morning in 1983, standing on a parade ground in Devon with rain coming in sideways off the channel, wearing his beret for the first time and feeling something that he described years later to his children as the most purely good feeling he had ever experienced. A feeling of completion, of having become something that had previously been only an aspiration, of having passed a test that many people never take, and a significant portion of those who take it do not pass. He served in the Royal Marines for 22 years, did 3 tours of Northern Ireland, served in the Gulf, deployed to Kosovo, and eventually left as a sergeant major, taking with him a body of experience and a set of standards that he carried, somewhat uncomfortably, into a civilian life that could not quite match the intensity of what had come before. His story is not unusual in its broad outlines. It is, in fact, close to typical. The trajectory of motivation, selection, training, service, and eventual separation that describes the career arc of thousands of Royal Marines across the past half-century. Something similar could be said of the young Americans who find their way to Paris Island or San Diego. People from every corner of the country, from every background imaginable, who arrive at the recruit depot carrying 100 different reasons for enlisting and who leave, 13 weeks later, carrying one shared identity that supersedes all the individual reasons. The Marine Corps is one of the few institutions in American life that takes people from genuinely diverse backgrounds and produces, through the alchemy of shared hardship and shared tradition, something that functions as a genuine community. A community whose bonds were tested and found real in the worst moments of the training, and which translates directly into the combat cohesion that every military commander hopes for and that some never achieve. The commando tests at the end of Lympstone are the threshold that separates those who earn the Green Beret from those who do not. But what makes Lympstone distinctive is not just those final tests. It is the 32 weeks that precede them, the relentless accumulation of physical demands and skill requirements, and leadership challenges that build, week by week, a different kind of person from the one who arrived. Men who complete Lympstone are not simply fitter and more skilled than when they arrived. They have been through an experience that has changed how they understand their own limits, has demonstrated to them, through repeated evidence, that the line between what they can do and what they cannot do is much further out than they believed when they arrived. The soldier who does not know where his actual limits are, who has never had them tested, will stop before he needs to stop, will fail tasks that he was physically and mentally capable of completing, simply because he has never experienced what it feels like to keep going when everything is telling him to stop. Lympstone, like the Marine Corps crucible, but at greater length and greater intensity, systematically tests and moves that limit, and the Green Beret is the evidence that it worked. What both systems share is something that is more important than any specific drill or physical standard: the deliberate creation of a genuine role transition, a shift in self-concept that changes not just what a person can do, but who they understand themselves to be. The person who completes the crucible or earns the Green Beret is not the same person who showed up on day one. The institution has done something to them that cannot be undone, and that was the point all along. Both the Marine Corps and the Royal Marines accomplished this transition through different means and at different speeds, with a consistency and completeness that most institutions, civilian or military, never achieve. When two strangers who have never met discover that they are both Marines, or both Royal Marines commandos, they know things about each other immediately and without any further discussion, that each has been through something genuinely difficult, that each has been measured against a standard that many people cannot meet, that each has chosen, at some decisive moment in their life, to keep going when stopping would have been easier, and nobody would have blamed them for it. That shared knowledge creates a bond that operates below the level of conversation, a recognition that is more reliable than almost any other form of human identification, because it is not based on what someone says about themselves, but on what they have demonstrably done. Beyond the physical standards and the operational histories, both the United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines possess something that resists quantification, but that is central to understanding why both organizations perform the way they do: culture. The United States Marine Corps has one of the most distinctive institutional cultures of any military organization in the world. It is a culture built on paradox. The Marine Corps is simultaneously part of the United States Navy Department, and fiercely independent from it, is the smallest of the American services and arguably the most well-known, is funded less generously than the Army or Air Force, and yet consistently achieves results in combat that its larger rivals do not surpass. The paradox is part of the identity. Marines are taught from their first days in the Corps that they are the few, the proud, that membership in this organization is a privilege that comes with requirements that not everyone can meet, that the eagle, globe and anchor they wear is a mark of earned distinction. The culture expresses itself in specific ways. Marines maintain a uniform standard and a bearing that is instantly recognizable. The dress blue uniform, deep navy blue with red trim and gold buttons, is one of the most visually impressive in any military, and Marines wear it with a pride that is not affected but genuine, rooted in what was survived to be allowed to put it on. The language of the Corps, the specific phrases and traditions that distinguish Marine speech from civilian speech, is another expression of culture, a set of shared references that create a sense of belonging and mutual recognition among strangers who have never met but who immediately know things about each other that words cannot fully convey. The Royal Marines culture is in some ways similar and in some ways very different. The green, beret tradition and the commando ethos create a similarly strong sense of institutional identity. But the Royal Marines culture has a distinctive British quality that includes a certain understated irony, a reluctance to express pride too loudly, a preference for letting the deeds speak rather than the words. The 9 qualities of a Royal Marine commando: courage, determination, unselfishness, cheerfulness in the face of adversity, professional standards, fortitude, commando humour, humility and excellence, are worth pausing on, because they are not quite what you might expect from a military organisation. Commando humour is unusual enough to merit comment. The Royal Marines have a tradition of finding things funny in circumstances that most people would find anything but. A dark, specific, often self-deprecating humour that serves both as a coping mechanism for extreme stress and as a form of social currency within the Corps, a way of signalling that you are in control of yourself and your situation, even when nothing around you is controllable. It is the humour of people who have chosen to exist at the extreme edge of human experience, and who have decided that finding the absurdity in that choice is healthier than taking themselves too seriously. Humility is perhaps even more unexpected. Military organisations are not known for institutionalising humility. The Marine Corps' tradition of institutional pride, of being the best, of being the few, the proud, might seem to be the opposite of humble. But the Royal Marines make a specific distinction between justified confidence in the Corps' capability and the kind of arrogance that prevents learning. The Green Beret does not mean you have nothing left to prove. It means you have demonstrated the minimum standard required to begin the real work. This is a subtle but important difference, and it reflects something about the Royal Marines' long institutional experience with operations that have gone wrong. With the Gallipolis and the Walcherans alongside the Trafalgars and the Falklands, that makes overconfidence appear not just dangerous but stupid. Any honest account of what these institutions demand from their members must also account for what those demands cost, not in the abstract, not in the statistical aggregate, but in the specific human terms of the men and women who carry the weight of service long after the uniform comes off. Combat is not an experience that leaves people unchanged. The science of what happens to the human nervous system when it's subjected to repeated life-threatening stress, and to the experience of causing death or witnessing the death of people with whom one has formed strong bonds, has advanced considerably over the past generation, and what it has established is something that experienced veterans have always known, that the psychological effects of combat are real. They are physiological rather than merely psychological, and they do not simply resolve themselves given enough time and enough silence. Both the Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps have invested considerably more in veteran mental health support than either institution did a generation ago. The cultural shift away from the old stigma around seeking mental health help has been gradual and imperfect but real, driven in part by the visible scale of the problem following 2 decades of intensive combat operations. The institutional recognition that asking extraordinary things of people creates an extraordinary institutional responsibility to those people is now more explicit than it has ever been. But the gap between institutional intention and individual reality remains significant. Veterans who struggle to translate their military experience into civilian terms, who find that the intensity and clarity of purpose that military service provided is replaced by civilian contexts that feel, in comparison, almost meaninglessly undirected. These are people for whom the institution's post-service responsibility extends well beyond the formal transition process. The 2 Corps also have a formal program of exchange officers, Royal Marines serving with Marine Corps units, United States Marines serving with Royal Marines units, that has been running for decades and has produced a steady flow of institutional knowledge between the 2 organizations. American officers who serve with the Royal Marines consistently describe being struck by the quality of the individual Marines and the level of autonomy granted to junior officers and NCOs. Royal Marine officers who serve with the USMC consistently describe being impressed by the scale of the institutional support available, the logistics, the aviation, the organic firepower that the Corps can bring to bear in a way that the much smaller British force cannot match. When American Marines and British Royal Marines operated in adjacent areas or in combined formations in Helmand Province, the professional respect that developed between the 2 groups was genuine and mutual. American Marines recognized in the Royal Marines the same orientation towards service and the same culture of professional pride that they identified in themselves, expressed differently but rooted in the same institutional DNA. One of the most significant transformations in both corps in the 21st century has been the gradual and contested integration of women into combat roles. The United States Marine Corps began integrating women into combat roles following the 2015 Department of Defense decision to open all combat positions to women. The Royal Marines opened commando training to women in 2018. In both cases, the standards were not lowered, and the women who have passed through the Marine Corps Crucible and received the Eagle, Globe and Anchor, or who have completed Commando Week at Lympstone and earned the Green Beret, have done so on the same terms as everyone else. No history of either the Royal Marines or the United States Marine Corps would be complete without some attention to the role of music and ceremony in the life of both institutions. The United States Marine Corps Band, the President's own, is the oldest professional musical organization in the United States, having been established in 1798 at the same time as the Corps itself. The Marines' hymn, From the Halls of Montezuma to the Shores of Tripoli, is a compressed history, a set of specific references to specific battles that every Marine knows and that every Marine understands as connecting them to a specific and honoured lineage. The Royal Marines Band Service provides music for state occasions and military ceremonies with a tradition that has made it one of the most respected military bands in the world. The Beating Retreat ceremony, conducted annually on Horse Guards Parade in London, is one of the great set pieces of British military pageantry. Both serve the same institutional function. They make the history tangible. They give the abstract connections to the past a specific sensory dimension that memory preserves more reliably than narrative alone. Both the United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines have undergone significant transformations in the early 21st century, driven by the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq, and by the changing strategic environment that includes new threats, peer competitors like China and Russia, the continuing evolution of terrorism, the potential for conflict in Arctic and island environments, and cyber warfare. The United States Marine Corps under General David Berger's Force Design 2030 has made the most dramatic doctrinal shift in the Corps' history since the development of amphibious doctrine in the 1930s. The new vision retains the amphibious core of the Corps' identity, but reimagines how it operates. Smaller, more distributed units operating from small ships and expeditionary advanced bases in contested maritime environments, particularly in the context of potential conflict with China in the Pacific. The Corps has divested itself of tanks entirely, reduced its artillery and fixed-wing aviation, and invested heavily in long-range precision fires, anti-ship missiles, and the ability to operate in a degraded communications environment. This transformation has been controversial. Critics argue that the Corps is making itself too specialized for one particular scenario, competition with China in the Pacific, at the expense of the broader amphibious capability that has been its strength for 80 years. Supporters argue that the world has changed, that peer competitors have invested heavily in anti-access/area denial capabilities that make traditional large-scale amphibious assaults prohibitively costly, and that the Corps needs to evolve or become irrelevant. The debate is genuinely important and genuinely unresolved, and it will shape the Marine Corps for the next generation. The Royal Marines have undergone their own significant evolution, centred on the Future Commando Force concept, a vision of Royal Marines operating in small, highly capable teams that can conduct operations across the full spectrum from conventional combat to information operations to humanitarian assistance, with the technological tools to be genuinely effective in all of those domains. The Future Commando Force emphasizes the ability to operate in extreme environments, particularly the Arctic, with greater technological sophistication than previous generations of Royal Marines have had available. The deployment of Royal Marines to the High North, Norway, Iceland, the Arctic generally, has increased significantly in recent years, reflecting both the renewed strategic importance of that region as Arctic ice retreats and opens new sea routes, and the specific advantage that the Royal Marines' cold weather training gives them over competitors who have not invested comparably in that capability. The Corps' annual training exercises in Norway have produced generations of Royal Marines who are genuinely comfortable operating in sub-zero temperatures, who understand how cold weather changes the performance of weapons and vehicles and the human body, and who have developed the specific survival and navigation skills that Arctic operations require. We have now travelled 3.5 centuries of history, from the Duke of York's Maritime Regiment in 1664 to the Future Commando Force of the 2020s, from Toon Tavern in 1775 to the Pacific Strategic Design of 2030. We have watched both corps born, tested, nearly destroyed, reformed, expanded, contracted, deployed, recalled, and sent out again. And the question with which we began, which is better, has, I hope, become more interesting than it seemed when we started. The honest answer is that the question is not quite the right one. The United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines Commandos are not identical organizations trying to solve the same problem. They are distinct institutions that grew out of different national traditions, serve different strategic purposes within their respective military systems, operate at vastly different scales. The USMC numbers around 170,000 active duty personnel. The Royal Marines number around 8,000, and are optimized for somewhat different kinds of operations. The USMC is designed to be a large, flexible, combined arms force capable of conducting major amphibious operations and sustained land combat. At its best, it combines the professionalism and elite culture of a special operations force with the scale and firepower of a conventional army. It has the logistical apparatus, the air wing, and the organic command structure to conduct operations that would overwhelm a smaller organization. The Royal Marines are designed to be a small, extraordinarily capable force of commandos whose quality is maintained at a level that their size makes possible. Every Royal Marine Commando has completed the same 32-week training course, has passed the same commando tests, has earned the same Green Beret. The homogeneity of quality is possible precisely because the Corps is small enough to maintain it. Asked which is better, the most coherent answer is that each is better at what it was designed to do. A Royal Marine unit conducting a deep reconnaissance in the Norwegian Arctic, navigating by compass through a blizzard in terrain where even military vehicles cannot operate, is operating in conditions where the USMC has no comparative advantage. A Marine Expeditionary Force conducting a large-scale amphibious assault against a defended coast with the full weight of marine aviation and artillery in support is executing a mission that is well beyond the Royal Marines' organic capability. But in the space where the two organisations overlap, small unit leadership, physical excellence, the ability to maintain discipline and effectiveness in conditions of extreme adversity, the culture of professional pride and institutional identity that makes each corps more than the sum of its individual members. In that space, the comparison is genuinely close, and the similarities are as striking as the differences. Both corps have produced warriors of extraordinary quality across 3.5 centuries. Both have been tested to their absolute limits multiple times and have come through. Both carry institutional memories that shape how their current members think and act, even when those members have never been told explicitly why a particular tradition or standard exists. It exists because someone, at some point in the long history of the Corps, learned through blood and fire why it mattered. And perhaps that is the most important thing to say about both of them. Neither the United States Marine Corps nor the Royal Marines is primarily a war-fighting machine in the crude sense of that phrase. A system optimized for destroying enemy forces. They are at a deeper level systems for the production of a particular kind of person, someone who has been tested thoroughly enough to know what they are capable of, disciplined enough to direct that capability toward coherent ends, and connected deeply enough to a tradition of service that the question of why they do what they do never really needs to be asked. The question has already been answered by the men at Belleau Wood, by the Marines at Chosin, by the Royal Marines at Goose Green, and on the slopes of Two Sisters in the dark, answered in a language more durable than words, and passed down across the generations in the only way that really works, by demanding the same things of each new generation that were demanded of every generation before it, and trusting that the meeting of that demand will produce the same result it has always produced. That is the secret, if it can be called a secret, of both institutions. Not equipment, not doctrine, not any particular tactical system. The secret is the sustained, deliberate, uncompromising transmission of a standard of physical capability, of professional knowledge, of personal courage, and of institutional loyalty, that each generation receives from the one that preceded it and passes to the one that follows. It is a remarkably simple idea, and a remarkably difficult one to execute. Both the Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps have been executing it, imperfectly but consistently, for longer than most nations have existed. There is a tradition in the United States Marine Corps that every Marine, regardless of rank, regardless of how long they have been in the Corps, regardless of whether they are currently serving or have been out for 40 years, is addressed as Marine. Not Sir or Ma'am in the generic sense, not veteran but specifically Marine. Because in the Corps' understanding of identity, the status is permanent. You earn it once through the crucible and the training that follows, and it stays with you for the rest of your life. The phrase, once a Marine, always a Marine, is not a recruitment slogan. It is an accurate description of how identity works within the institution. The Royal Marines have an equivalent understanding expressed somewhat differently but rooted in the same insight about the permanence of what is earned. The Green Beret once awarded is not taken back. The commando who has left the Corps remains, in the understanding of everyone who ever served alongside him, a Royal Marines commando, someone who passed through that particular crucible, who stood on Dartmoor in the rain and kept moving when moving seemed impossible, who earned something that cannot be duplicated by any other means and cannot be taken away by any subsequent circumstance. This permanence of identity is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate institutional design, of a training process that is demanding enough that completing it changes the person in a fundamental and irreversible way, and of a culture of tradition and history that gives that change a context and a meaning that extends far beyond the individual who undergoes it. When a new Marine receives the Eagle, Globe and Anchor at the end of the Crucible, or when a new Royal Marine Commando receives the Green Beret at the end of Commando Week, they are not just receiving a symbol of personal achievement. They are joining a community of people who have had the same experience, made the same sacrifices, earned the same right to call themselves what they now call themselves, and they are being connected to all the people who made that same journey before them, stretching back across the centuries to the Duke of York's Maritime Regiment and to Toon Tavern, and to the beaches of the Caribbean and the frozen mountains of Korea and the bogs of the Falklands. History is not abstract for either of these corps. It is personal. It is the story of specific people in specific situations making specific decisions that had specific consequences, and the men and women currently serving in both the Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps are aware, in a way that most people are not aware of their institutional heritage, that they are part of that story, that what they do now will be remembered by those who come after them in the same way that they remember those who came before. The Royal Marine officer who trains his unit on the moors of Dartmoor is not doing so in ignorance of the long chain of Royal Marines who trained on those same moors before him, who were assessed by the same criteria, who endured the same cold and the same exhaustion, and emerged on the other side of it as something that the cold and the exhaustion could not touch. The Marine Sergeant who speaks to his recruits about what it means to be a Marine is drawing on a tradition that reaches back to the Continental Congress, and to Samuel Nicholas, and to the night before the Battle of Belleau Wood, when an unknown gunnery sergeant allegedly said to his men, facing a French major who suggested they retreat, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Whether or not that particular story is literally true, and there is legitimate historical debate about its attribution, it captures something true about the institution and the people who have always populated it. The Marine Corps and the Royal Marines have, across their respective histories, been institutions where the standard response to being told that a thing cannot be done is to do it anyway, to discover through action rather than analysis where the real limit lies, and to bring back proof that the limit was further out than the skeptics believed. That is not a myth. It is a record, written in every operation from Nassau to Normandy, from Chosin to Helmand, from Gallipoli to the Falklands, and it is a record that continues to be written right now, in training grounds and deployments and quiet operations that never make the news, by men and women who looked at what was required to join these organisations, decided they could do it, discovered in the process that doing it was harder than they had imagined, and then did it anyway. As we look toward the coming decades, both the United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines face strategic environments of considerable complexity and genuine uncertainty. Peer competitors like China and Russia have invested heavily in capabilities specifically designed to prevent the kind of large-scale, conventional military operations that the Western alliances have relied upon for 3/4 of a century. The proliferation of precision-guided missiles means that the large ships that carry and support amphibious forces are now far more vulnerable than they were in 1944. And the emergence of cyber warfare, information operations and unmanned systems means that future conflicts will almost certainly look different from past ones in ways that are difficult to predict with confidence. Neither approach, the USMC's focused bet on the Pacific or the Royal Marines' hedge toward versatility, is obviously correct. Both represent genuine strategic reasoning applied to genuine uncertainty by people who understand their organizations and the strategic environment deeply and who are trying to prepare for a future that cannot be fully known. The history of both corps suggests that they will adapt to whatever that future brings, that the institutional capacity for improvisation and resilience that has characterized both organizations across centuries of changing circumstances will not fail them now, even if the specific capabilities that the current moment demands are not identical to those that past moments required. You've been listening for a long time now. We have travelled from 17th century naval barracks to the frozen peaks of Korean mountains, from a Philadelphia waterfront tavern to the bogs of the Falkland Islands, from the cannon smoke of Trafalgar to the urban labyrinth of Fallujah. We have watched two institutions build themselves over centuries, test themselves against the full range of human adversity, and emerge each time changed but not broken, reduced in size but not in spirit, uncertain about the future but never uncertain about who and what they are. The question we began with, which is better, has not been answered with a simple declaration, because the simple declaration would be a lie. Both are extraordinary. Both have earned, through 3.5 centuries of accumulated sacrifice and achievement, a place among the finest military institutions that human civilization has produced. To declare one categorically superior to the other would be to misunderstand both, to reduce something that is genuinely complex and genuinely remarkable to a contest whose terms cannot capture what is actually being compared. What is true is that both corps share something more fundamental than the differences between them. Both understand that certain things, discipline, excellence, the willingness to go into the worst places in human experience and do what needs to be done, cannot be improvised or purchased or directed from above. They can only be cultivated slowly and deliberately through a combination of tradition, selection, and training that forms character the way a blacksmith forms metal, through repeated application of heat and pressure until the material becomes something that the original or never was. Both institutions have also been honest, in their best moments, about the cost of what they demand. The young man from Sunderland standing in the November rain on a Devon parade ground, wearing a green beret for the first time, he had paid for that moment with months of a kind of discomfort most people will never experience. The 19-year-old from anywhere in America who holds the eagle, globe, and anchor in his palm at dawn after 54 hours without real sleep, he has paid for that moment too, in the currency of the crucible. Neither of them would say it was too high a price, but both of them know what it cost, and knowing what it cost is part of what the bray and the emblem mean. They are not trophies, they are receipts. History ultimately is a series of receipts. Each generation of both these corps has paid its bill in whatever currency the moment required. Sometimes blood, more often time and effort, and the particular kind of pain that comes from choosing difficulty when ease was available. The payment was real, the account is open, and somewhere right now, on a wet hillside in Devon, or in the swamps of South Carolina, or in the mountain cold of Norway, someone is making another payment on the same account, adding their small portion to a debt that began accumulating in 1664 and 1775, and that will not be settled until the last Marines and Royal Marines commandos hang up their berets for the final time, which, if history is any guide, will not be happening soon. The Royal Marines and the United States Marine Corps have been doing that cultivation for 3.5 centuries and 2.5 centuries respectively. They have no intention of stopping.